The iron wheel shrieked against the desert hardpan, and Graham Morgan was already on the ground before the stagecoach lurched to its final, grinding halt. He had driven this route for 4 years, Tucson to Silver Creek, Arizona Territory, 1883, and he had never once lost a wheel. Not in monsoon mud, not in spring floods, not in the baking July heat that turned the Sonoran scrub into a shimmering hallucination. But today, on a cloudless Thursday in late October, the left rear axle had cracked clean through, and the coach listed hard to one side like a ship taking on water. He heard the passengers inside cry out. He heard luggage thud. He heard the specific, furious silence of 5 people realizing they were stranded 40 miles from Silver Creek in country that did not forgive. He swung down from the box, hit the ground running, and circled to assess the damage. The axle was not merely cracked. It was shattered, the iron cap split from the wooden shaft, and the wheel itself had ridden up at a sickening angle that told him everything he needed to know. This was not a roadside fix. This was a full rebuild, and he had precisely one spare iron cap in the boot and no spare shaft. He pressed his hand to the back of his neck and looked at the wide, indifferent sky. He had already calculated the water situation. He had already calculated the time before sunset. He had already calculated, with the cold precision of a man who had ridden bad country his whole life, the exact dimensions of the problem. None of it was good. The door of the coach swung open and they came out one by one. First came Reverend Aldous Prout, 62, perspiring through his collar, who immediately declared that Providence would see them through. Second came Marcus Holt, a traveling dry goods salesman with a sample case he refused to set down, who immediately declared that the Overland Stage Company would hear about this. Third came Nora Holt, Marcus's wife, who sat down in the shade of the coach's tilted body and pressed a handkerchief to her forehead without speaking. Fourth came a boy of about 8 named Samuel, who was apparently traveling alone to meet his father in Silver Creek, and who, with the philosophical resilience of childhood, immediately began turning over flat rocks. And then came the fifth. She stepped out of the tilted coach with the particular careful grace of someone who had spent years navigating the world without help, setting her boot onto the metal step, and then dropping lightly to the ground. She wore a dark brown traveling dress, practical rather than fashionable, and her dark hair was pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. She was perhaps 26, 27, with a face that was not immediately soft, a face that had some history in it, some weather, some private reckoning. She carried a single carpet bag, and she set it in the dust beside the coach without ceremony. Then she looked at the broken axle. She looked at it the way Graham himself had looked at it, with a surveyor's eye, taking in the split iron cap, the angle of the wheel, the position of the coach body. Not with fear, not with outrage, with assessment. She looked up at him. "Do you have a spare cap?" Graham stared at her. In 4 years of driving, not a single passenger had ever asked him that. "I have one," he said slowly, "but the shaft is cracked through and I have no spare shaft." She set down her carpetbag and walked closer to the wheel, crouching down in the dust of the road without the slightest concern for her dress. She ran her hand along the fractured wood, feeling the grain of the brake. "It cracked along the grain," she said, "not straight through. If you have enough iron banding wire and a piece of hardwood you can use as a sister brace, you can bind the 2 halves, and it will hold long enough to limp the coach to Silver Creek at reduced speed." Graham did not speak for a moment. Behind them, Marcus Holt said something sharp about women offering opinions on mechanical matters, but Graham did not hear it because he was looking at her face, and something behind his ribs had shifted, quiet and certain, the way a compass needle finds north. "I have wire in the tool box," he said. "I don't have hardwood." She stood, brushed the dust from her hands, and looked at the scrub around them. "That mesquite branch there is hardwood enough." "Do you have an axe?" He had an axe. That was the moment. That single, ordinary, extraordinary moment in the Arizona dust, 37 miles from anywhere, when Eudora Blackwell looked at a broken axle and saw a solution, and Graham Morgan looked at Eudora Blackwell and forgot briefly that he knew how to speak. He never forgot her face. But that was not the moment of crisis, not truly. The crisis came later in Silver Creek when he discovered who she was, what she had hidden, and what it was going to cost her. Let him take you back to how it all began. She had been waiting at the Tucson depot that morning with the quiet patience of someone who expected nothing comfortable from the day. The other passengers had already been in conversation when Graham loaded the boot, Reverend Prout telling Marcus Holt about the new church going up in Silver Creek, Marcus Holt telling the Reverend about the new hardware merchant who was cutting into his territory, and Nora Holt saying nothing to anyone about anything. Young Samuel had arrived in the care of a depot clerk who had clearly been relieved to hand him off. Eudora Blackwell had purchased her ticket at the window, taken her receipt without speaking beyond what was necessary, and stationed herself near the left rear wheel of the coach, where she spent 5 minutes watching Graham grease the axle housing with the attentive focus of a woman who had reasons for knowing whether the equipment was sound. He had noticed, of course. Drivers noticed everything. It was how they survived. Something wrong? He had asked her. She had looked up at him without embarrassment. I've ridden coaches with bad axle grease before. I like to know what I'm getting into. He had almost smiled. The grease is fresh. Changed it last night. Good, she said, and had picked up her carpetbag and climbed in without another word. He had thought about that exchange all the way to the first water stop at San Pedro Creek, which was unusual because Graham Morgan was not, by disposition, a man who thought about passengers. He thought about weather. He thought about road conditions. He thought about the horses, 2 grays and 2 roans, who had opinions about everything and needed to be managed with care. He did not think about passengers. He thought about this one. He told himself it was because she was unusual and left it at that. The road from Tucson to Silver Creek in October of 1883 ran southeast through country that was trying to decide what it was. The saguaro forests of the Sonoran gave way gradually to the mesquite grasslands of the San Pedro Valley, and then the road climbed slowly into the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains, where the air changed and smelled of juniper, and the light had a different quality, clearer and colder, like looking through glass that had not yet been used. It was beautiful country, and it was dangerous country, and Graham knew both its beauties and its dangers with the intimacy of long acquaintance. The axle cracked at mile 43, on a downhill grade that was not steep but was rutted with dried-out wagon tracks from the summer haul season. He felt it go in the soles of his feet before he heard it, a deep, structural vibration followed by the sound of iron complaining at the very edge of its tolerance. He had pulled the team to a stop immediately, but not immediately enough, and now here they stood in the dust. He sent young Samuel up onto a flat rock to watch for other traffic, which was unlikely but gave the boy purpose. He acknowledged Reverend Prout's assessment that Providence was indeed on their side. He told Marcus Holt with professional patience that the Overland Stage Company would certainly hear about it from Graham himself in the required incident report. He made sure Nora Holt had water. Then he went to work with Eudora Blackwell. He brought the tool box down from the boot, and she was already there waiting, her hat set aside in the dust, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her forearms were not those of a woman who had spent her life in parlors. There were small scars across her left hand, old ones, long since healed to silver lines. "What do you know about axles?" he asked her, not challenging, genuinely curious. "My father ran a freight operation in New Mexico," she said, picking through the toolbox with practiced efficiency. 3 wagons. We were often the only hands available. She found the wire coil, held it up to check the gauge, and nodded. "This will work. Wrap it tight enough and it distributes the stress along the brace rather than concentrating it at the fracture point." He looked at her sidelong. "Where are you headed in Silver Creek?" Something moved across her face, quick and controlled, there and gone. "Visiting family," she said, and did not look up from the wire. It was a clean lie. He knew it the way he knew weather instinctively from atmospheric pressure. But he did not press her, because the axle needed fixing and the sun was moving and he had 4 other passengers to consider. He cut the mesquite branch she selected, a straight length about 18 inches, hardwood through and through, green enough to have some give but dense enough to hold the brace. She held the cracked shaft halves in alignment while he fitted the sister piece and began the wire wrap, and he was aware, with a peripheral acuteness that surprised him, of the steadiness of her hands. Not a tremble, not a hesitation. She held the shattered wood in exact alignment for 23 minutes while he wrapped, tightened, and secured the banding wire with a technique that his father had taught him for wagon repairs on the Cimarron. They did not speak much during the repair. They did not need to. There was a specific efficiency to working alongside someone who understood what was required without instruction, and Graham had not experienced it with another adult in longer than he could easily remember. When the repair was complete, he stood and tested the wheel, rocking the coach body, watching the brace hold. It would hold. It was not elegant, but it was sound enough for 40 miles at a walking pace. "Good work," he said, and meant it entirely. She picked up her hat, knocked the dust from it, and put it back on her head. "Don't exceed 4 miles an hour and keep the team balanced on the downhill," she said. "It should get you there." He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than professional necessity required. "I'm Graham Morgan." She met his eyes. Hers were dark brown, almost black in the midday light, and they held something that he could not immediately name, something that was both direct and guarded, like a door open just wide enough to let you see there was a room beyond it but not wide enough to show you what was inside. "Eudora Blackwell," she said. The name did not mean anything to him yet. It would, but not yet. They loaded back into the coach, all 5 passengers. Graham climbed to the box, and they moved south at a slow, careful pace through the afternoon heat, the brace holding, the horses steady, the sky absolutely clear above the dragoons. Marcus Holt spent the first 20 minutes of the resumed journey making remarks about the delay, addressed generally to the interior of the coach, received by no one in particular. Reverend Prout read his Bible. Samuel fell asleep against the window. Nora Holt watched the landscape with an expression that Graham, from his position on the box, could not see but which, Eudora would later tell him, was the expression of a woman who had been somewhere else in her mind for years. Eudora Blackwell watched the road. Graham watched the horses and the road and the horses again, and he was honest enough with himself to know that some portion of his attention was occupied by the woman inside the coach, by her steady hands and her surveyor's eyes, and the lie she had told him about visiting family. It was not an unpleasant occupation. It was, in fact, the most engaged he had felt in months. They arrived in Silver Creek at 4:30 in the afternoon, which was 2 hours and 15 minutes later than scheduled, which was actually remarkable given the repair they had made on the road. Silver Creek in October of 1883 was a town in its second decade of existence, which was to say it had survived long enough to have 2 churches, a proper hotel, a sheriff's office, a telegraph office, and a school that had been operating for 3 years, and had not yet become respectable enough to be boring. It sat in a broad valley between 2 ridges of the dragoons, watered by a creek that ran year-round, which was the reason for its existence. The silver mine that had given it its name had played out in 1878, but the town had pivoted to cattle and farming and commerce with the adaptive urgency of a frontier community that did not want to become a ghost, and it had survived. Graham pulled the damaged coach into the overland stage yard, called for the yard hands to take the horses, and climbed down from the box with the particular deliberate care of a man whose joints had been asking difficult questions for the last several hours. The passengers disembarked. Marcus and Nora Holt were met by a heavy-set man Graham did not recognize. Reverend Prout was met by no one and walked off in the direction of the new church with purpose. Samuel was claimed by a relieved father who had been waiting in the yard since noon. Eudora Blackwell stepped out last, picked up her carpetbag, and looked at the town with an expression that Graham could not immediately categorize. It was not the arrival face, not the relief of a journey's end or the anticipation of welcome. It was closer to the face of a soldier arriving at a contested position, assessing, readying. He said, without entirely planning to, "Is someone meeting you?" She looked at him. That pause again, that fraction of a second where she decided something. "No. There's a good hotel on Main Street, the Clearwater. Mrs. Fenwick runs it. It's clean and the price is fair." Something shifted in her expression, small but real, like a window opening. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan." "Graham," he said. Another pause. "Thank you, Graham." She walked away into the town, and he watched her go with the specific feeling of a man who has missed a train but cannot yet say with certainty which destination it was heading for. He filed his incident report in the stage office, spoke to the yard foreman about the axle, and then walked the 4 blocks to his rooming house on 2nd Street, where Mrs. Gallegos kept a clean room for him and left his supper on the stove when his arrival was late. He ate beef and beans and thought about the road. He told himself he was thinking about the road. He was thinking about the hands that had held a broken axle in alignment for 23 minutes without asking for relief or recognition. The next morning brought a problem. He was taking his breakfast at the short-order counter of the Silver Creek restaurant, which was the kind of place that served coffee strong enough to be used as a cleaning solvent and eggs that had no pretensions to beauty but were filling, when Sheriff Tom Aldred walked in, took a stool 2 down from Graham and said, without preamble, "You drove in yesterday's stage." "I did," Graham said. "You have a woman passenger, traveling alone, dark hair." Graham set his fork down slowly. "Why?" Aldred was a compact man of 50 who had been wearing the same expression for at least 40 of those years, patient and slightly tired and very hard to fool. He had been the law in Silver Creek for 6 years, and he was the kind of sheriff who was neither corrupt nor heroic, just steady, which in Graham's view was worth more than either. "She's wanted," Aldred said. "Or might be. Got a wire last night from a John Blackwell out of Albuquerque. Says his wife has run off with estate funds. Wants cooperation in returning her." The words fell into the silence of the restaurant like stones into still water, and Graham felt the ripples of them reach his spine. "How much?" he asked, in a voice he kept completely flat. "The wire said several $100s, doesn't specify." "John Blackwell," Graham said. "You know him." "I know the name." He was silent for a moment. "I don't know the details of the matter." Aldred looked at him with the patience of a man who had read many faces. "She's staying at the Clearwater." Graham thought about dark brown eyes that were also somehow black, about a lie told cleanly, about visiting family, about hands that did not tremble. He thought about the scars on her left hand. "I recommended it," he said carefully. "I don't know if she went." She had gone. He had seen her turn toward Main Street. Aldred nodded, drank his coffee, and said, "I'll pay a call." He did not say it with relish or with threat, just with the weary professional duty of a man who followed wires. Graham finished his eggs because throwing away food in this country was a kind of sin, and then he left the restaurant and walked directly to the Clearwater Hotel. He was not proud of what he felt in that walk, which was the particular sharp anxiety of wanting to warn someone, and not being certain he had the right to, not knowing the truth of the situation, not knowing if he was about to interfere with justice or with injustice. But he knew one thing from the moment Aldred had said, "John Blackwell," and it was the thing the scars on her hand had already told him quietly, without words. She was not a thief. He knew this the way he knew weather and road conditions, from evidence accumulated in the body's deep intelligence, from the way she had said the word family with a particular controlled distance, from the fact that her carpetbag was all she carried, from the fact that she had looked at Silver Creek with a soldier's face. He walked into the Clearwater's small lobby and asked Mrs. Fenwick at the desk if a Miss Blackwell was in. Mrs. Fenwick, a comfortable woman of 55 who considered herself a good judge of character and said yes, the lady was in the dining room having her breakfast. Graham went through. She was sitting at a corner table with her back to the wall, which told him something, and she was reading a newspaper which told him something else, and when he walked through the door she saw him immediately and her hand moved fractionally toward the bag at her feet before she recognized his face and stopped. He sat down across from her without asking. "We need to talk quickly," he said. "The sheriff has a wire from Albuquerque, from a John Blackwell." All the color left her face. Not dramatically, not like a stage performance, but genuinely, the blood retreating from her skin the way it does when the body's arithmetic suddenly produces a number it did not want. Then it came back. Not because the fear left, but because she made a decision. "My husband," she said, "my former husband. We were divorced by the territorial court in August. The estate funds he is referring to are my inheritance from my mother, which he took into his control when we married and which I withdrew legally upon the finalization of the divorce." Graham listened to all of this without interruption. "The documentation?" he asked. "In my bag." She did not reach for it. She held his gaze. "Why are you telling me this?" It was a fair question, a direct question. It deserved a direct answer. "Because I wanted you to know before he came," Graham said. "And because I don't know that you've done anything wrong." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face changed, not softened exactly, but opened slightly, like that window he had imagined opened another inch. "He sent men after me in Albuquerque," she said quietly. "That's why I left. The divorce was legal, the withdrawal was legal, but John Blackwell doesn't operate within those categories when he feels he's been defied." "How long have you been on the road?" 3 weeks. "I've changed routes twice. I thought Silver Creek was far enough." A small, bitter precision to that last word. "Apparently not. The sheriff here is a fair man," Graham said. "If your documents are in order, he'll see that." "Fair men have been persuaded by powerful ones before," she said. "I have seen it happen." He could not argue with that because it was true and they both knew it, and the territory was full of examples. "Let me come with you when you speak to him," Graham said. She stared at him. Why? He thought about this. He thought about it honestly, which was not always comfortable. "Because I was on that road yesterday, and you spent 23 minutes in the heat holding a broken axle in alignment, so that 4 other people could get where they were going, and you didn't ask for anything in return. Because that's the kind of person I want in my corner, and I'd like to think I'm the kind of person who can say the same." He paused. "And because Tom Aldred has known me for 4 years and trusts my judgment." Eudora Blackwell looked at him for a long time, long enough that Mrs. Fenwick, passing through the dining room with a coffee pot, glanced at them both with benign curiosity and kept moving. "All right," she said finally. They went together to the sheriff's office, which was 3 blocks north on Main Street, a brick building that smelled of coffee and old paper and the particular institutional patience of law. Aldred was at his desk when they arrived, and he looked at Eudora with no particular expression, and at Graham with a slightly more particular one. Eudora opened her carpetbag and laid the documents on the desk with calm, precise hands. The divorce decree from the Second Territorial Court of New Mexico, dated August 14, 1883. The notarized accounting of the transferred funds, countersigned by the court clerk. The letter from the Albuquerque bank confirming the withdrawal against the account that held, as stated in the decree, funds determined to be the separate property of Eudora Blackwell, née Eudora Alcott, per the terms of settlement. Aldred read every page. He read slowly, which Graham appreciated. A man who read slowly was a man who meant to understand rather than confirm what he already thought. Then Aldred sat back and said, "The wire from John Blackwell describes this as an unauthorized withdrawal." "The court decree authorizes it explicitly," Eudora said. "Page 3, the 3rd paragraph." Aldred checked page 3, paragraph 3. He read it again. "The wire also says she left with marital property," Aldred said. "What I left with is itemized in the last page of the settlement document," Eudora said. "Everything I took is listed there as my separate property under New Mexico territorial law." Aldred looked at Graham. Graham met the look with the steady face of a man who had no stake in the matter beyond what he had stated. "Well," Aldred said finally, "the wire doesn't constitute a warrant and the documents appear to be in order." He folded the papers back carefully and returned them to her. "I can't detain you, Miss Blackwell. If Blackwell wants to pursue this, he'll need to go through the courts, and that'll take time." "He has men," Eudora said quietly. "He won't wait for courts." Aldred's face did not change, but something behind his eyes became more attentive. "Has he threatened you physically?" She was silent for a moment. She looked at her left hand, the one with the silver scars, and then she looked at Aldred. "He is not a man who threatens, he acts." The room was very quiet. "I'll keep an eye out," Aldred said in a tone that was not dismissive. "And I can ask Deputy Reyes to make a few extra passes near the hotel." He paused. "How long are you planning to stay in Silver Creek?" Eudora looked at her hands. "I'm not certain," she said. "I hadn't planned further than getting here." Graham walked her back to the Clearwater in the cool October morning, and they said nothing for half a block, and then he said, "You were headed west. To start over." It was not a question. She recognized it as not a question. "California," she said. "San Francisco. I have a distant cousin there. I have enough money to establish myself if I can get there safely." She paused. "The plan was clear enough when I made it in Albuquerque. It's gotten somewhat complicated since then." "Understatement," Graham said, and it surprised her enough that she laughed, short and real, catching herself as if laughter was something she had to monitor carefully. He found that the most revealing thing she had done yet. He stopped on the boardwalk in front of the milliner's shop on the corner of Main and 2nd and turned to face her. She stopped too and looked up at him. He was not a small man, 6 feet and lean from years on the box in all weathers, with the sun-dark skin and the crow's feet of outdoor work, 31 years old and carrying roughly the weight of 35. "I have a layover of 2 days before my next run," he said. "I know this town well. I know who in it can be trusted and who cannot. If someone is coming for you, you should not be navigating that alone." She studied him with those direct, complicated eyes. "You don't know me, Graham." "I know you better than I know most people I've traveled with for a week," he said. "I know how you work when things go wrong. That's not nothing." She was quiet for a long moment. A wagon passed on Main Street and someone called a greeting from across the road that neither of them answered. "I'll be careful about your kindness," she said finally, and there was something in her voice that was both the warning and the gratitude at the same time. "Be anything you like about it," he said. "Just don't refuse it outright." She looked at him, and the window opened another inch. "I won't," she said. The next 2 days had a quality that Graham would spend a long time afterward trying to describe to himself with accuracy, because they were not romantic in any conventional sense, not in the way that the word was generally deployed. There were no dances, no rides in the moonlight, no flowers. There was instead a deepening familiarity that felt, to Graham, more substantial than any of those things. They ate supper together twice at the Silver Creek restaurant and talked the way 2 people talk when they are genuinely curious about each other without yet having permission to be. She told him about growing up in New Mexico, the daughter of Cornelius Alcott, who had run freight wagons between Santa Fe and Albuquerque for 20 years, and had raised his daughter to understand that a woman in this territory had better know how to do practical things, because the alternative was dependence, and dependence was a kind of vulnerability she had seen destroy people. She told him about her mother, Clara, who had died of fever when Eudora was 16, and who had left her a sum of money in a private account that Cornelius had never touched, and that she had thought of ever since as her mother's last protection, a hand reaching forward through time. She told him less about John Blackwell, but enough to paint the picture. He had been charming and established, a land attorney in Albuquerque with connections that reached the territorial government, and she had been 23 and newly arrived in the city after her father's death, managing the freight business's liquidation, and he had seemed like stability and safety in a moment when she had neither. It had taken her 8 months of marriage to understand that what she had mistaken for stability was control, and what she had mistaken for safety was the particular false security of a cage that had not yet been locked. "I stayed 2 years," she said one evening, not with shame but with the factual weight of someone who had long since stopped being anything but clear-eyed about their own history. I stayed because leaving is not simple and because I wanted to believe it was repairable. It was not repairable. Graham listened to all of this and did not offer reassurance, which she would have found insulting, and did not offer outrage, which she would have found performative. He offered silence, the good kind, the kind that says I am here and I am hearing you and I do not need to fill this space with something less than the truth of what you've said. She noticed. She told him so, obliquely. You listen well, she said. I've been on the road with a lot of people, he said. I've learned that most of what people need is to be heard and to not be argued with while they're being heard. What about you? She asked. Where did you come from? He told her. Kansas, originally, a farm east of Wichita, where he had grown up knowing cattle and dry land and the particular stoic silence of plains families that communicated through work rather than words. He had come west at 22 with nothing much to distinguish him, except that he was good with horses, and had the spatial intelligence to read a road the way some people read print, instinctively, seeing conditions and consequences before they arrived. He had been driving for the Overland Stage Company for 4 years now, not because it was his final destination, but because it was honest work and he was good at it, and the territory was beautiful in a way that got into you permanently. Don't you want to stop moving? She asked. A place of your own. Sometimes, he said, more lately. He did not elaborate, but he looked at her when he said it, just briefly, and she understood the direction of the statement without either of them needing to become embarrassed about it. On the second afternoon, he walked her to the telegraph office and stood outside while she sent a wire to her cousin in San Francisco, letting her know she was delayed. And on the way back, they passed the new church, Reverend Pruitt's church, and Pruitt himself was on the steps, and he said hello to Graham and looked at Eudora with an expression that Graham recognized as the specific curiosity of a man who has witnessed something and does not know what it will become. That evening, the news arrived that Graham had been half expecting. Deputy Reyes came to the Clearwater just as they were finishing supper and asked to speak with Miss Blackwell privately, and then, with the practicality of someone who saw no reason for unnecessary formality, told them both, since Graham was sitting there and clearly involved. 2 men had arrived in town that afternoon on the southbound road from Benson, and they were asking about a woman traveling alone with a carpetbag. Reyes described them. One tall, one heavyset, both armed, both spending money at the saloon and asking questions too specifically to be casual. Eudora's face went to that soldier's expression again, but something else was in it now too, a deeper tiredness, the tiredness of a person who has been running long enough to feel the weight of the road in their bones. He moves fast, she said, almost to herself. These men work for your husband, Graham said. Former husband, she corrected automatically. Yes, likely men from his law practice. He keeps 2 men permanently for work that courts don't handle. Graham looked at Reyes. What does Aldred want to do? He wants to talk to them in the morning, Reyes said. Remind them politely that they're in his county and that he has seen Miss Blackwell's documents and found them in order. He thinks the reminder will be enough to send them on their way. And if it isn't, Eudora said, Reyes had an honest face, he used it. Then we'll have more conversations. After Reyes left, Eudora sat at the table for a long while and looked at the lamp. Graham sat with her. He did not try to make the situation less serious than it was. He also did not allow the silence to become despair. In the morning, he said, if Aldred's conversation sends them packing, we talk about getting you to Benson to catch the westbound connection. I can speak to the stage manager about a route that isn't the obvious road. There are alternatives. You have a run scheduled in 2 days, she said. You said so. I know this road in ways that a guide map doesn't, he said. I know which of the ranchers along the Western Pass have fresh horses and which of them I can trust to say nothing to strangers with questions. I've moved freight through worse conditions. There are ways to get you to Benson ahead of anyone who's looking for you. She stared at him. Graham. What? Why are you doing this? He met her eyes and he was honest, because she was a woman who could hear honesty and deserved nothing less. "Because you matter," he said. "It was very simple, it was not decorated. You've mattered since the road. I know that's fast, and I know you have every reason to be cautious about the judgment of men, and I'm not asking you for anything. I'm telling you that you matter to me, and I'd rather know you're safe in California than be comfortable here wondering." The lamp burned between them, and outside in Silver Creek, the October night settled over the streets with its cold clarity, and Eudora Blackwell looked at Graham Morgan for a long time with those dark and complicated eyes, and he watched the window open. "Not all the way, but enough. I believe you," she said. "I'm not certain I should." "You should be cautious," he said. "You should never not be cautious. But you can be cautious and still believe someone." She was quiet for a moment. "I would like to get to San Francisco," she said. "Then let's get you to San Francisco," he said. Morning came cold and clear, with the kind of crystalline light that the Arizona high country produces in October, when the summer heat has finally surrendered and the air has gotten honest again. Graham was at the stage yard before sunrise, speaking with the yard foreman, Bill Hendricks, a leathery man of indeterminate age who had opinions about horses and very few opinions about people, which Graham had always found restful. He explained, in general terms, that he needed to move a passenger to Benson outside of the regular run, and that discretion about the departure time was important. Hendricks looked at him without expression for a moment, and then said that there was a supply wagon going to the Crispin Ranch outside Benson on the morning of Graham's next scheduled run day, and that it would need a driver, and that if Graham happened to drive it and happened to have a passenger, that was nobody's particular business. Graham shook Hendricks's hand and considered this a minor but meaningful grace. Aldred had his conversation with the two men that morning, a conversation that Graham learned about second-hand from Rays, who stopped by the Clearwater to relay it. Aldred had been factual and clear. He had established that the documents were in order, that he had no grounds for any action against Miss Blackwell, and that he would be unhappy, professionally and personally, if two armed men from out of county created any kind of disturbance in his town while looking for someone who had committed no crime he could identify. One of the men had tried to suggest that there were other ways of looking at the situation. Aldred had looked at him until he stopped suggesting. They did not leave town. That was the problem. They went back to the saloon and they stayed. Eudora received this news at the Clearwater with the calm of a woman who had already accounted for this possibility. "John will tell them to wait," she said. "He'll come himself or send a legal document. He always has several strategies." "Then we're on a clock," Graham said. "We were always on a clock," she said. He told her about the supply wagon. She listened, asked 3 practical questions about the route and timing, and then agreed. They would leave 2 days earlier than Graham's scheduled run, on the pretext of the supply delivery before dawn, by the back road that ran behind the stage yard and joined the Benson Road 12 miles out, well past the main travel corridor where strangers with questions would be watching. Those 2 days of waiting had their own texture. He spent them doing what he would normally do, tending to the horses, checking equipment, taking his meals. But the days were different in their fundamental quality because of a walk he took each afternoon, a walk that passed by the Clearwater Hotel, where Eudora spent the daylight hours in the hotel's small sitting room reading, or in the back garden when the sun was warm, and where Graham would stop and they would talk, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer. They talked about everything, and nothing in the way that two people talk when they are becoming known to each other at speed, when circumstances have stripped away the usual social pacing. She told him about the books she loved, novels primarily, and the way she had read her way through her father's small freight office library of perhaps 30 volumes, until each of them was nearly memorized. He told her about the stars over the desert road at night, about driving in total darkness guided by landmarks he knew well enough to feel in his hands through the horses. She told him about wanting to learn things, not for any particular use, but because learning itself felt like standing on higher ground. He told her about the specific piece of a horse that trusted you. They were sitting in the back garden of the Clearwater on the second afternoon when she said, quietly and without looking at him, "I am afraid." He did not say it was all right because it was not a thing for him to decide. He said, "I know. I've been afraid for 3 weeks," she said, "and I've been managing it because I had to, but I am very tired of managing it." She paused. "I don't usually say things like that." "No," he said, "I don't think you do. You make it easier to say them," she said. "I'm not entirely sure what to make of that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the careful directness of a man who had thought about words before using them, "I don't need you to make anything of it right now. We have a road to travel first. There's time for the rest of it later." She looked at him then, and the expression on her face was one he had not seen from her before, not the soldier's face or the surveyor's face or the controlled public face. It was something simpler and more unguarded, a face that said she had heard him and believed him and was, perhaps for the first time in a long time, not alone in something. He almost said the thing he was thinking. He stopped himself, because there was a road to travel, and because she deserved to feel safe before she felt anything else, and because he was a man who understood that some things required the right ground underfoot. They left Silver Creek at 4 in the morning, 2 days early, in a supply wagon loaded with flour sacks and tools for the Crispin Ranch, under a sky full of stars that looked, at that altitude, as if you could reach up and move them around. The horses were a pair of bays from Hendrix's personal stable, good road animals, calm and steady. Graham drove. Eudora sat beside him on the wagon box, wrapped in a heavy blanket. Mrs. Fenwick had pressed on her over her own wool coat, with her carpet-bag secured in the wagon bed. They did not speak much for the first 2 hours. The road required attention in the dark, and the cold required fortitude, and there was something about traveling in the deep pre-dawn that encouraged a quality of silence that was not uncomfortable but simply necessary. He was aware of her beside him as a warm presence, as the sound of her breathing, as the occasional shift of her weight when the wagon wheel found a rut. Around 6, when the sky began to lighten in the east with the specific rose and gray palette of an Arizona October dawn, she said, "Tell me something." "What kind of something?" "Something that isn't about the situation," she said. "Something from before all of this." He thought about it. "My father was a farmer," he said. "Plains farmer, Kansas. He never once talked about what he felt, about anything. Not joy, not grief, not anger, nothing. He communicated exclusively through work. If something was wrong, he fixed it. If something was good, he kept doing it. I used to think that was a limitation." He paused. "I've come to think it was a specific kind of language that he spoke fluently, and I just didn't have the grammar for it when I was young." She was quiet for a moment, listening. "Do you have it now?" "Better than I did," he said. "Though I've added some spoken words to the vocabulary," she smiled. He couldn't see it clearly in the near dark, but he heard it in the small change in her breathing. "My mother talked constantly," she said, "about everything. Every thought she had, she put in the air. I think I have some of her and some of my father's silence, and they argue with each other sometimes." "I've noticed," he said. "You've noticed a great deal," she said. "Occupational requirement," he said. "A driver who doesn't notice things is a danger to everyone." "Is that all it is?" she asked, and the question was light and also not light at all. "No," he said honestly, "not with you." The dawn came on fully as they descended from the foothills into the broader flatlands north of Benson, and with it came the clarity of a world made visible again, the sage and scrub and distant mountains, the road unrolling ahead of them pale and straight, and no one behind them. He found himself, at some point in that long morning, thinking about the future with a specificity that was new to him. Not the immediate future of Benson and the westbound connection, but beyond that. The shape of a life lived differently from the one he currently occupied. It surprised him, and also did not surprise him at all. They reached the Crispin Ranch at mid-morning, unloaded the supplies with the help of 2 ranch hands who had no particular interest in passengers, rested the horses for an hour, and then drove the final 12 miles into Benson on a road that was wide and well-traveled and entirely normal. They arrived at the Benson Stage Depot at noon. The westbound connection to Tucson and then to the Southern Pacific Railroad terminus was scheduled for 2 days hence. Graham arranged a room at the Single Hotel in Benson, a rougher establishment than the Clearwater, under a name that was not Blackwell, and he paid for it himself over Eudora's precise objection, which he overrode with the argument that drawing attention to any financial transaction at the desk was unwise, and she conceded the point with the expression of someone who is agreeing with the argument while reserving the right to pay him back later. They had 2 days in Benson. Benson in 1883 was a railroad town, newer than Silver Creek and harder-edged, built in the specific utilitarian style of places where commerce was the primary fact of existence. It had fewer trees than Silver Creek and less ambition toward civility, but it had a telegraph office and a general store, and a woman named Mrs. Paz who sold the best tamales in the San Pedro Valley from a cart on the main street. And Graham bought 2 of them and they ate standing beside the cart in the afternoon sun. And the whole time the situation was still serious, but there was also this. Eudora Blackwell had enchilada sauce on her chin and did not notice, and Graham told her, and she wiped it off without embarrassment, and they stood there in the warm October light in a border town at the edge of everything and laughed. He would remember that moment for the rest of his life. On the second day in Benson, Graham sent a wire to Overland Stage Company explaining that a personal matter had required him to take a brief personal leave from his scheduled run, and that he would return within the week. This was not entirely false, merely incomplete. He did not expect the company to be delighted, and they were not, but the response wire was merely pointed rather than terminating, which was the best outcome he had hoped for. He also sent a wire to a man he knew in San Francisco, a former stage company supervisor named Arthur Webb, who now managed a shipping office on the waterfront, and who owed Graham a favor from an incident 3 years previous that neither of them had to discuss by name. He told Arthur briefly that a woman of good character needed temporary assistance finding reputable work and accommodation upon arrival, and asked if Arthur could arrange an introduction to a trustworthy boarding house and any legitimate commercial employment. Arthur's reply came the next morning. He would be glad to help, and was sending the address of a reliable boarding house run by a Mrs. Louisa Crandall in the Mission District, along with an introduction to an accounting firm that he understood was looking for a competent bookkeeper. Graham brought this wire to Eudora, who read it 3 times. "You arranged this," she said. "I asked a friend to look into it," he said. "You'd asked what my intentions were. Well, this is part of them." She looked up from the paper. "Graham, you should have something solid waiting for you," he said. "Not an uncertainty, not a hope, something real." She was very quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something in it that had not been there before, something that had come uncovered like earth after ice. "I have not had someone do something like this for me in a very long time," she said. "You should have been having it done all along," he said. "That's not a comment on anything except that you deserve better than what you've had." She folded the wire carefully and put it in her carpet bag, and then she stood very still for a moment, and then she crossed the 3 feet between them and took his hand, both of her hands around his one, and she held it. He did not say anything. He did not move. He let the moment be entirely what it was. They stood like that in the spare hotel room in Benson, Arizona Territory, in October of 1883, and outside the window the main street of the town was conducting its ordinary business, and neither of them was thinking about John Blackwell or axles or wires or the road ahead. And it was, Graham thought, the most natural thing in the world. The coach to Tucson left at 7 the following morning, and there was a particular emotional complexity to the morning of departure that neither of them fully acknowledged but that both of them fully felt. He had helped load her bag. She had stood beside him while he checked the horses, old habit or new habit, her eyes moving over the axle and the wheel housing in that surveying way that made him smile privately. "It looks sound," she said. "It is sound," he agreed. She turned to face him, and they were standing close together in the way that people who have become accustomed to each other's physical proximity stand without marking it as significant, and she looked at him with the full directness of those dark eyes. "Come to San Francisco," she said. "Not right away when you can, but come." It was not a question, it was not exactly a declaration. It was an invitation, offered with the careful precision of a woman who had learned that it mattered what words you used. He looked at her and felt the full weight of the last 5 days settle into something permanent in his chest, something that was not going to shift or diminish regardless of distance or time. "Tell me when you're settled," he said. "I'll come." She kissed him then, briefly, her hands on his face, a kiss that was both a promise and a proof. And then she stepped back and picked up her carpet bag and walked to the coach and got in without looking back. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew herself well enough to know that if she looked back she might not get in. He watched the coach leave Benson in the early morning light, and he stood in the street for several minutes after the dust had settled. He drove back to Silver Creek with the empty supply wagon, returned the bays to Hendricks, and reported to the stage office to face the pointed comments of his supervisor, a man named Carmichael who had precise opinions about schedules. He absorbed these without argument, took his next run assignment, and went back to work. He was waiting for a letter. It came 3 weeks later, from San Francisco. She wrote the way she spoke, directly, with the specific precision of a woman who chose her words carefully and used exactly as many as were necessary. The boarding house was good. Mrs. Crandall was a practical and kind woman, and the accounting position was beginning the following Monday. She had visited the offices of an Albuquerque attorney who practiced territorial law, and who confirmed that John Blackwell had no legal grounds to pursue the matter into California, and that his only recourse would be the courts, which would take years, and which he was unlikely to pursue given that the money was less than his pride but more than his patience, and his pride would ultimately prevent him from admitting publicly that a territorial court had ruled against him. She was free. She wrote that last sentence without ornamentation, just the 2 words on a line of their own, and he read them twice and felt the relief of them in his own body. She also wrote at the end of the letter, "I think about the road a great deal. I think about the axle," a pause in the writing, evidenced by a slight change in the pressure of her pen. "I think about you a great deal. I wanted to be honest about that." He wrote back that evening, at the small desk in his room at Mrs. Gallegos' house, by lamplight, and was honest in return. The correspondence between them over the following 2 months was one of the formative events of Graham Morgan's life, and he would say so afterward without embarrassment. They wrote twice a week, which, given the distances and the vagaries of the Arizona Territory mail, was not always achievable but was consistently attempted. They wrote about work, about the small events of their days, about ideas that they had been turning over, about the book she was reading and the road he was driving. They wrote about their families and their histories and their private opinions about the world, with a freedom that the road had opened in them, and that the correspondence maintained. In the 3rd week of November, he wrote, "I keep calculating when I can get to San Francisco, and I keep running up against the same wall of my own hesitation. I don't want to hesitate. I want you to tell me that the invitation still stands and that is not foolish." She wrote back, with a speed that told him she had answered the moment the letter arrived. "The invitation stands. Come when you can. Being here is not enough without the possibility of you in it." He spoke to Carmichael the following Monday and arranged 3 weeks of accumulated leave. He arrived in San Francisco on a Friday in December, having taken the Southern Pacific from Benson to Los Angeles, and then the coastal connection north, a journey of 3 days that he spent largely looking out the window at the changing landscape with the specific impatience of a man who knows exactly where he is going and is simply waiting for the distance to be resolved. She was at the station. He saw her before she saw him, standing on the platform in a green coat he had not seen before, her dark hair down rather than pinned for once, and she was scanning the crowd with her eyes, looking for him with an expression that was composed and alert, and beneath the composure there was something that he could see clearly now, something that was not guarded at all. He stepped off the train and she found him, and for a moment they just looked at each other with the particular recognition of people who have been thinking about each other's faces for 2 months and are now confirming that the reality is even better than the memory. "You came," she said. "I said I would," he said. "People often say things," she said. "I don't," he said. She looked at him steadily for another moment, and then she crossed the platform and he put his arms around her, and she held on with the kind of holding on that has nothing performative in it, nothing managed, just the real and uncomplicated weight of someone who is exactly where she wants to be and is not pretending otherwise. He stayed 3 weeks. He met Mrs. Crandall, who regarded him with the measuring approval of a woman who had seen a great many men come through her boarding house, and considered herself a reliable judge of which of them were worth anything, and who within 2 days had apparently decided that Graham was acceptable, a judgment she conveyed not through words, but through the provision of coffee and the willingness to leave them alone in the sitting room after supper. He met Arthur Webb, who was hearty and direct, and took them both to dinner at a restaurant on Market Street, and told the story of the 3-year-old favor with enough embellishment to make it funny. He met Eudora's cousin Catherine, who was a school teacher, and who looked at Graham with the careful attention of someone who had heard a great deal about him, and was comparing the description to the original. He and Eudora walked the city, which was nothing like anything he had lived in before, a city of fog and commerce and stunning geographical drama, all hills and bay, and the specific vitality of a place that had been rebuilt from disaster 25 years before and had not forgotten how to be vigorous. He had grown up on flat plains and lived in high desert, and the compression of San Francisco, everything crowded together on its improbable hills, was a kind of shock to his spatial instincts that was also, he found, exhilarating. They talked for hours. They walked for miles. They had supper together every evening and breakfast when the household schedule allowed, and they were careful with each other in the way of 2 people who have both been through things that have made them thoughtful about what they ask of another person. But they were also, increasingly, simply happy, which was its own kind of navigation. On the second-to-last evening of his visit, they were sitting on the steps outside Mrs. Crandall's boarding house in the cold December dusk, looking at the lights of the city coming on below them, and Eudora said, "I need to say something carefully, and I want you to hear it carefully." "All right," he said. "I have been alone, effectively, for a long time," she said. "I was in a marriage that was a form of aloneness, and then I was literally alone on the road. And I have been alone here, although it has been a good aloneness, the kind you can live in." She paused. "I'm telling you this because I want you to know that I am not coming to you out of need. I am coming to you because I want to. Because you are someone I want to be near. Because you are the most genuinely good man I have encountered in my adult life." Another pause, "and I want you to know the difference." He was quiet for a moment. The city glittered below them and the cold was clean and sharp. "I know the difference," he said. "And I want you to know that I have spent the last 2 months understanding that the road I want to be on is the one that ends with you, not driving through, ending with." He turned to look at her. "I know that's a large thing to say. I mean it to be a large thing." She looked at him for a long time, and then she said, very quietly, "I believe you. I believed you the first time you were honest with me. I've been believing you ever since." "Then I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to say no if the answer is no, because a no from you is worth more than an easy yes from anyone else." He was steady and calm as the desert on a clear morning. "Will you marry me, Eudora?" She was silent for a very particular kind of moment, the kind where you can hear a person taking a full and genuine breath. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." The following morning was his last day in San Francisco before the return journey. It was a happy morning, with a different quality of happiness from anything that had preceded it, more settled, more certain, the happiness of something decided rather than something hoped for. They told Mrs. Crandall, who was satisfied. They told Arthur Webb by letter. They sent a wire to Catherine, who wired back immediately with 3 exclamation points, which given Catherine's general temperament was essentially a standing ovation. They arranged that Eudora would continue at her accounting position through the end of February, giving adequate notice and settling her affairs in San Francisco, and that she would travel to Silver Creek in March, where they would be married. He would arrange everything on his end, which he was confident about in the specific way of a man who knows the territory and the people in it. He left on the afternoon train with the particular feeling of a man who is going in the right direction. The return journey was different from the arrival journey in the way that all journeys are different when you know what you're returning to, when you're not driving away from something but towards something, and the landscape that had been merely scenery on the way out was on the way back a legible text, every stage of it marking the closing distance between where he was and where he would eventually be standing next to her. He arrived in Silver Creek in late December, reported to Carmichael, and drove his scheduled runs through January and February with the professional competence that was his baseline, and with something additional underneath it, a steady private energy that the horses, in their perceptive animal way, seemed to register as a quality of attentiveness they responded to. He spoke to Reverend Prout about the marriage, and Prout received this news with the particular warmth of a man who had witnessed the beginning of something on a stagecoach road and had been privately hoping for this outcome. He spoke to Tom Aldred, who said congratulations and also in the same breath that there had been no further word from John Blackwell, whose legal options had apparently been exhausted by the New Mexico territorial settlement, and who had, according to a wire from a contact in Albuquerque, moved his professional activities to Denver, and appeared to have decided that the whole matter was less worth pursuing than his pride had initially suggested. "He's leaving her alone?" Graham asked. "By all indications," Aldred said, "men like that generally move to a new situation when the old one stops producing the leverage they require." Graham nodded slowly. It was not justice, exactly. It was the absence of injustice, which was not the same thing. He held the knowledge of what Blackwell had been, and what he had done to Eudora with a quiet anger that he would carry for a long time and that would never fully go away. But it was an anger he could contain because it no longer had a practical application, and containing it was in her service because she deserved to move forward rather than be kept anchored to the past by his feelings about it. He wrote her all of this. She wrote back that she was relieved, and that she had expected nothing better and nothing worse from John Blackwell, and that she was ready, and that March could not arrive quickly enough. March arrived. She came on the Thursday stage, the same route he drove, though he was on his layover and someone else was on the box. He was waiting at the stage yard when the coach pulled in, standing precisely where he had been standing 8 months ago when she had first stepped out of the coach with her carpetbag and her surveyor's eyes. He was wearing his best clothes, which were decent rather than impressive, and his hat was clean and his boots were polished, and he had the appearance of a man who is trying to be worthy of the moment. She came out last, as she had before. She was wearing the green coat from San Francisco, and her hair was pinned up under the wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days and had apparently survived the journey, and she looked at him across the yard with those dark and direct eyes, and she smiled. It was the first full, unguarded smile he had seen from her, the one with nothing held back, and it was, he thought, the most beautiful thing in the Arizona territory. He crossed the yard to her. They were married on a Saturday in the second week of March, in Reverend Prout's church, which smelled of new lumber and beeswax candles and the slight mustiness of hymnals that had been traveled with. The congregation was small, a collection of people who had come to know Graham over his 4 years in Silver Creek, Mrs. Gallegos and her husband, Bill Hendricks and his wife, Deputy Reyes and his family, a handful of drivers and yard hands who had worked alongside Graham, and Arthur Webb, who had made the journey down from San Francisco for the occasion, and who stood in the second pew with the expression of a man who is very pleased with how a situation has resolved itself. Catherine had traveled from San Francisco, and she sat in the front pew beside Mrs. Crandall, and both of them wept at appropriate moments and some inappropriate ones, which was exactly right. Eudora walked up the aisle alone, because there was no one appropriate to walk with her, and because she had decided, characteristically, that the independence of the gesture was more honest than the convention. She walked up the aisle with the straight-backed precision of a woman who had come through a great deal, and arrived at this moment on her own power, and Graham watched her come toward him, and felt everything he had been accumulating in his chest over the past 5 months resolve into a single clear note. Prout said the words, they said the words. Graham put his mother's ring on Eudora's finger, a simple gold band that he had kept in his breast pocket for 6 years since his mother's death, never certain what it was waiting for and now entirely certain. She looked at it on her hand, and then she looked at him. "All right," she said softly, which was not the traditional response but which made Graham laugh. And then Prout was pronouncing them husband and wife, and they kissed in the smell of new lumber and beeswax, while Mrs. Gallegos and Catherine both made sounds of approval from their respective pews. The reception was at the Silver Creek restaurant, which the proprietor, a man named Ellis, had closed for the afternoon in Graham's honor, setting out a spread of cold meats and bread, and 2 kinds of pie and enough coffee to float a boat, and people stood around eating and talking with the relaxed ease of a community celebrating one of its own and welcoming someone new into the circle. Arthur Webb gave a toast that was funny and genuine, and referenced the telegram favor in just enough detail to be mysterious to everyone who hadn't been involved. Catherine gave a toast that was heartfelt to the point of inarticulate, which made it more heartfelt rather than less. Even Aldred said a few dry words that contained more warmth than their surface temperature suggested, and when it was done, when the afternoon had settled into evening and most of the guests had drifted home and Graham and Eudora were sitting together at the corner table with the last of the coffee, she put her hand on the table between them, palm up, and he put his hand over hers. "You know what I kept thinking about today," she said. "Tell me." "That broken axle," she said. "I kept thinking about that road and that afternoon and the way you looked at me when I asked you if you had a spare cap. How did I look?" she considered. "Like I'd said something in a language you recognized but hadn't heard in a long time," she said. He thought about that. "That's exactly right," he said. In the months and years that followed, life in Silver Creek arranged itself into something that neither of them had entirely designed, but that both of them recognized as precisely what they had wanted. Graham continued driving for the Overland Stage Company for another year before the expansion of the Southern Pacific Rail lines into the territory began to make the longer stage routes commercially uncertain, and he left the stage company with no particular regret, and with a decade's worth of savings that had been accumulating in a bank account in Tucson, while he lived frugally on the road. He bought a small property east of Silver Creek, 30 acres on the creek itself, with a 2-room house that needed work and a barn that was sound, and a view of the Dragoons that was, in all 4 seasons and in all lights, magnificent. Eudora, who had continued her accounting work, taking on the books for 3 Silver Creek businesses including the New Merchants Bank, which paid well and valued her accuracy and discretion enormously, came out to the property on the first afternoon after the purchase and walked every acre of it with the surveying focus that Graham had known and loved since the road. "The house needs work," she said. "I know," he said. "The barn is sound. I know. The view of the mountains is extraordinary. I know that too." She turned to look at him, and the afternoon sun was on her face, and it had been almost 2 years since the road, and she was more fully herself now than she had been then, less guarded, less armored, with a quality of ease that sat over her strength the way the light sits over the land, illuminating rather than obscuring. She was 28 years old and she was the most complete person he had ever known. "Let's build it right," she said. "Let's take the time to build it right." They did. The house expanded over the following 3 years, one room at a time, each addition considered and planned rather than improvised. And if the building was slower than a pure efficiency calculation would dictate, it was better for the slowness, more thought into each wall and window, more conversation about what it was meant to be and who it was meant for. Their first child was born in the spring of 1885, a boy they named Cornelius after Eudora's father, which made her cry in the good way when Graham suggested it, that specific surprise of being understood cry that meant more than the happy ones. Cornelius was dark-haired and alert from the start, with his mother's surveying eyes and his father's particular stillness, and he regarded the world from the beginning as a place of interest rather than threat. Graham learned, in the first months of parenthood, things about himself that the road had not taught him, specifically that he had reserves of patience and tenderness that had been waiting for a context in which to become useful. He was not a man who performed fatherhood, not a man who held the baby for company and then handed him back. He was present in the specific way that Eudora recognized as characteristic of him, fully and quietly present, attentive without drama. She told him once, nursing Cornelius in the evening light in the kitchen of the expanded house, that watching him be a father was the most convincing argument she had encountered for the idea that people could be fundamentally different from what their circumstances had tried to make them. "My father didn't speak much either," she said, "but he showed up. He was there. Every day he was there, and I didn't know how much that mattered until I had someone who wasn't." "Blackwell," he said. "Blackwell," she agreed, without particular heat. John Blackwell had become a past-tense fact, a thing that had happened and been survived and was not the largest truth about her life. Graham knew this and was glad of it. Their second child arrived in 1887, a girl they named Clara after Eudora's mother, and she came into the world with opinions about it from the first hour, expressing them with a volume and persistence that made the midwife, a Tohono O'odham woman named Rosario who had been delivering babies in the Silver Creek Valley for 30 years, say with great approval that this one would give no one any peace and would accomplish great things as a result. Rosario was right on both counts. By 1888, the Blackwell Morgan property, which was what people in Silver Creek called it even though the deed said Morgan, was a functioning small ranch. Graham ran 40 cattle on the creek pasture, raised horses with the specific knowledge and care that came from years of partnership with them, and had acquired a modest reputation throughout the valley as a man who was fair in dealing and whose word was bankable. Eudora ran the accounts for several businesses still, had added the Silver Creek School to her roster of clients at the request of the school board, and had begun, quietly, to teach a Friday afternoon class in arithmetic and basic literacy to women in the valley who had not had access to schooling, in the room behind the church that Prout offered with the warmth of a man who considered it entirely consistent with his professional mission. Tom Aldred retired from the sheriff's office in 1889 and was succeeded by Deputy Reyes, who was younger and equally fair, and had the additional quality of speaking Spanish fluently, which made him considerably more useful in a valley whose population was roughly half Mexican and entirely underserved by law enforcement that couldn't communicate with half its constituents. Graham attended Aldred's retirement dinner and said words that made the old sheriff pretend to be interested in the ceiling for a moment. Arthur Webb came down from San Francisco twice, once for Cornelius's christening and once just because he wanted to see what they had built, and both times he sat on the porch of the expanded house looking at the dragoons with the expression of a man who is very glad for other people and slightly envious of them, which Graham thought was the appropriate response. Catherine came every year, without exception. She and Eudora would sit in the kitchen for hours while the children orbited around them, and their conversation was the kind of conversation between sisters by blood of the heart, the kind where everything is simultaneously known and endlessly interesting, and where the laughter that erupts suddenly and often comes from a shared history dense enough to need only a glance to ignite. In 1890, Eudora received a letter from an attorney in Albuquerque informing her that John Blackwell had died. He had died in Denver of a cardiac failure, at 53, in circumstances that were described as comfortable, which probably meant alone. He had remarried briefly, and the remarriage had apparently ended in divorce. He had left no children. His estate, which had been considerably reduced from its peak by several unsuccessful land speculation ventures, was in the process of being settled among distant relatives. Eudora read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and was silent for a moment. Graham was aware of this, was present with her in it without demanding anything from the moment. "I feel," she said slowly, "that I should feel something larger than I do." "What do you feel?" "Mostly, I feel that it is finished," she said. That's something that was always a possibility, him using the courts, him sending more men, him simply being there in the world as someone who had once controlled my life and wished to again. "It is finished." She was quiet. "I'm relieved. I'm sad in an old way for who I was when I believed he was something he wasn't, but I am mostly just relieved." "That's a fair accounting," Graham said. "It doesn't seem like enough," she said. "It's the honest one," he said. "That counts for more." She looked at him across the kitchen table, and the morning light was on her face, and she was 33 years old, and she was beautiful in the way that people become beautiful over time, the way a landscape becomes beautiful when you have learned it through every season and all its weathers, when the beauty is not in the pristine first impression but in the accumulated knowledge of it. "I love you," she said. "You know that, but I want to say it clearly sometimes because I believe in clear statements." "I know," he said. "I love you too, clearly and specifically and without conditions." He paused. "You can write that down if you want documentation." She laughed, and it was the full laugh, the unguarded one, and it filled the kitchen the way good light fills a room. Their third child arrived in the spring of 1891, another boy, whom they named Graham after his father, over his father's protest that this would lead to confusion, which it did, and which the boy resolved on his own initiative at age 4 by announcing that he was to be called Gray, which stuck immediately and permanently. By this time the house had become the house it was always supposed to be, 4 good rooms and a wide porch and a kitchen that had never once been too small for the people in it, and the land around it had settled into the specific productive quiet of a working ranch that knows what it is. The horses were excellent. The cattle were sound. The view of the dragoons was still magnificent, in all 4 seasons and all lights. Cornelius grew up with his mother's directness and his father's gift for roads, literal and otherwise. He was, by the time he was 12, the most reliable rider in the valley, knew every terrain feature of the dragoons, and had begun helping with the accounts in the evenings with a precision that made Eudora look at Graham sometimes with an expression of pure private satisfaction. Clara grew up exactly as Rosario had predicted, full of opinions and ambitions, and the specific generous ferocity of a girl who had been raised in a household where women's intelligence was not a novelty but an ordinary fact. She was going to be extraordinary. Everyone who knew her said so. She absorbed this assessment with equanimity and went back to whatever she was doing. Gray grew up gentle and observant, collecting rocks and insects and pieces of information about the natural world with the focused patience of someone who understands that the world is interesting enough without improving upon it. He had his mother's surveying eyes and his father's stillness, and was his own person entirely, which was the best possible combination. In the spring of 1893, 10 years after the road and the broken axle and the beginning of everything, Graham and Eudora rode out together on a Sunday morning on 2 good horses along the creek and up into the foothills of the dragoons, where the spring was making everything improbably green. They had left the children with Mrs. Reyes, who was their neighbor and their friend, and who managed all 3 with the comfortable authority of a woman who had raised 6 of her own. They rode without particular destination for an hour, through the mesquite and the juniper and the pale spring grass, and the mountains were all around them in the morning light, red and ochre and the deep gray of the older rock, and the creek ran quick and cold below them. They stopped on a flat rock above the creek where you could see the whole valley below, Silver Creek town in the middle distance, and the irrigated fields green around it, and the road running south toward Benson and northwest toward Tucson, the road Graham had driven for years, the road where everything had happened. "Do you remember," Eudora said, looking down at the road, "when you said you would get me to San Francisco?" "I said I would help get you there," he said. "You were always going to get yourself there." "Semantically generous," she said. "Historically accurate," he said. She looked at the road for a moment. "I think about that afternoon sometimes, the broken axle. All of us stuck out there in the heat, and Marcus Holt complaining and young Samuel turning over rocks. And you looking at the axle like you were going to solve it," he said. "I was going to solve it," she said. "I just needed the tools." He looked at her profile, the line of her face in the morning light, the dark hair with the first silver in it that had appeared in the last year and which he found, privately, extremely beautiful. 36 years old and as much herself as anyone he had ever known. "You know what I thought when you asked if I had a spare cap," he said. "What?" "I thought, who is this woman and why has no one been listening to her?" He paused. "And I thought I very much wanted to be the kind of man who listened." She turned to look at him, those dark eyes still direct, still complicated in the best possible way, still the face he had never forgotten from the moment he saw it. "You are," she said. "You've been that man the whole time." He reached over and took her hand, and she turned her hand to take his back, and they sat on the rock above the valley in the spring morning for a long time, looking at the road and the mountains and the land they had built their life in, and the silence between them was the good kind, the kind full of known things, of accumulated days and shared work, and the specific dense happiness of a life that had been constructed honestly and inhabited fully. Below them, Silver Creek went about its daily business. In the kitchen of Mrs. Ray's house 3 miles away, Cornelius was probably helping with the breakfast washing up, and Clara was probably arguing with someone about something, and Gray was probably looking out the window at a bird. Life was going on in all its ordinary and extraordinary particularity. "Another 10 years, Eudora said quietly, still looking at the valley. "At minimum," he said. "And after that?" "After that, another 10, he said. "I intend to be very thorough about this." She laughed, and he felt it against his hand, against his side where she had shifted closer, felt it in the air and in the light and in the specific quality of the morning. This life that had begun on a broken road in the October heat with a woman who looked at a problem and saw its solution, who had held broken things in alignment until they could be made sound, who had never once asked him to be anything other than what he was. He had never forgotten her face from the moment he saw it. He never would. The road ran south through the valley below them, dust and pale gravel and the long memory of every journey it had witnessed. And the mountains stood in the morning light as they had stood for 10,000 years before either of them was born, and would stand for 10,000 years after, indifferent and magnificent. And between a man and a woman on a flat rock above a creek in the spring of 1893, there was something that was not indifferent at all, something that was the opposite of indifferent. Something warm and permanent and chosen every single day. The horses waited patiently behind them, the way good horses do. The valley was quiet. The road went on. And everything that had been broken had been mended, carefully, with the right tools and steady hands, and the kind of time that only becomes available when you have found the right person to spend it with.